And so today I'd like to introduce our speaker, Kelsey Jenkins. Kelsey is a PhD candidate in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Yale. And Kelsey's work explores how the fossil record of reptiles can reveal dynamic changes in their anatomy that reflect how they navigated extinct ecosystems. Her talk today will focus on how a third eye came to be in both extinct and living reptiles, and how this special sensory structure on the top of their heads can be used to sense the world around them. So with that, please welcome Kelsey Jenkins.
Thank you for that introduction, Megan. I'm just going to figure out PowerPoint for just a moment. All right, hopefully you can all see a nice PowerPoint in front of you. Thank you all so much for that introduction. Thank you for coming today. I'm really excited to talk to you about what is currently my favorite chapter of my PhD. Today, it's really just an introduction into what this research is all about, but I do have some preliminary data I'm going to show you as well. And hopefully, if you find it interesting, you'll stay tuned for when the paper is published too. I want to start off talking about the third eye because it might be a familiar concept to some of you in the audience. The idea of this sort of invisible third eye is a pretty mystical concept in several Eastern religions, including Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism, among others. And while there are nuances and differences in the function of this third eye between these different religions, all imply that this organ provides a type of perception beyond what our quote-unquote regular eyes are ordinarily capable of seeing. So here you see the Hindu god Shiva on the left with a laterally oriented third eye, symbolizing knowledge and the detection of evil. On the right, you see Buddha, who's depicted here with a third eye, sometimes regarded as the eye of consciousness or the eye of wisdom. Now, this idea even carried on into more recent Western religious movements. This is Helena Blavatsky, a Ukrainian-born mystic who is the founder of the religion of Theosophy in the United States, where she rose to fame as a spiritualist and a psychic medium. Having traveled the world and dabbled in Eastern religions, she was very captured by the idea of a third eye, but found it to be more deeply entrenched in our own human biology. Helena, as well as some other founders of Theosophy, believed that the third eye actually referred to the pineal gland, what she thought was a partially dormant gland that sits between the two hemispheres of the brain. She claimed that the pineal gland was truly an atrophied eye, and it was far more connected to the soul and the spirit than any other physiological senses of man. Should we sort of reactivate this organ, in her opinion, we could tap into abilities within ourselves, such as telepathy. Now, the reason Helena rooted this idea in biology is because she knew a particular fun fact about lizards. Many lizards, as well as their close cousins, the New Zealand tuatara, possess what some might think of as an unusual feature on the top of their heads. All of these lizards are different species, but they have something really interesting in common, where you see these arrows and these circles. There's a very special scale located just behind the eyes on the forehead, if you will. What covers is a rudimentary eye. Now, this is an example from a fence lizard pictured on the right. If we were to dissect a lizard and look at a cross-section of the skull, which you see on the left here, right where that scale is, we'd see an organ that is in every way an actual eye. Just like the two eyes on your own face, this pineal eye possesses a retina, it possesses a lens, cornea. The only thing it's missing is the iris, so that's the part of your eye that contracts when a flashlight shines on your face or you enter into the sunshine. It's meant to restrict the amount of light entering into your eye at any given time. So it doesn't have that, but it has literally every other component of a regular eye. And this eye is closely associated with functions of that hidden pineal gland that we observe in humans, including things like growth and metabolism. Now, what I think is cool, but maybe it's obvious to you, is that there's evidence of this pineal eye, even if you just have the skull. On the right, you see the skull of the New Zealand tuatara, scientific name is Sphenodon punctatus, and you'll see where this arrow appears, there's a hole. We call that hole a foramen, and it's sitting right in the middle of the skull between two bones called the parietals. That's why this organ is also sometimes called the parietal eye, so you'll hear me switch back and forth between pineal eye and parietal eye, but they're the same thing. Now, just for comparison, I also have the skull of a wolf here, which doesn't have that parietal opening, and it does not have a parietal eye. Like all other mammals, it just has that pineal gland tucked within the brain. One hypothesis for this is, mammals are endothermic or warm-blooded. Because of this, they're able to regulate their metabolism and other body processes without the use of the parietal eye to tell them to go outside and bask in the sunshine. Now, similarly, crocodilians and turtles also lack this structure, though we don't think of them as endothermic animals. We have this idea from the fossil record, though, that their ancestors might have been. And as a result, these animals lost their parietal eyes at some point in their evolution and never evolved them back. But what does this organ actually do? There's been a slew of hypotheses and experiments over the years, and I admit this is an area that needs way more research, but we do have a rough idea that it has something to do with the ability to regulate body temperature in ectothermic or cold-blooded tetrapods. So imagine your typical lizard, it basks in the sun, which in turn affects all of the lizards' other body processes. This particularly warm time spent in the sun aids in metabolism temporarily, it aids in digestion, and it helps to produce the hormones that the typical lizard needs in its typical lizard life cycle. When the lizard is done basking, maybe he's overdone it a little bit, the parietal eye signals to him that it's time to go back in the shade. So the pineal eye, this parietal eye, isn't just about detecting light. It's an eye keeping watch on all the body's most important functions and processes, and it uses this as a signal to the lizard about those processes. Now, there is one additional hypothesis that there's potentiality that this is an organ that is linked to latitude or distance from the equator. The reason that latitude might be something we have to consider is that there's been some suggestion that there is a geographical relationship between the size and presence of the parietal foramen among modern lizards. While many lizards do have that parietal eye, some don't. And it was observed that species without a parietal eye occur in larger proportions at lower latitudes closer to the equator. Meanwhile, species with the parietal eyes are more abundant as you move to higher latitudes. In some ways, this is a pretty solid hypothesis. There's less variation in temperature as you move closer to the equator, so there might be less need for an organ to help you thermoregulate. However, there is an issue with this hypothesis as well. This trend was noted by mapping the distribution of lizard families, which is in part, geographically restricted. So it's hard to say if this latitudinal gradient of parietal eyes is due to how they function at different latitudes, or if it's just a product of where certain groups of lizards that have certain features in common are distributed because of their ancestry. So being a paleontologist, I really wanted to tackle this issue because it had some pretty major implications for how we might interpret the presence or absence of this feature when we look at the fossil record. In order to understand the anatomy of ancient animals, we really need to pin down, what this feature is doing and how it's functioning in modern living animals as well. So to test this hypothesis, I looked at a single species of lizard, this is Anolis sagrii, which is found across the entirety of the Gulf Coast, as well as many Caribbean islands and parts of Central America as well. And where this arrow appears, just make sure it appeared there, yep. Where this arrow appears, you'll see the parietal foramen. Now for this work, I CT scanned 57 specimens total from populations of 3 different latitudes spanning from Cuba, the Bahamas, and southern Florida. All of these populations are isolated from one another, which provides a really great system for testing this geographical hypothesis. If latitude plays a role, we would expect that those that are closer to the equator would have smaller parietal foramina. So we would expect those lizards from Cuba to have the smallest, and we would expect them to be larger and increase in size as we move northwards up to the Bahamas and southern Florida. Now, from there, we needed to take a few measurements from the skull. That includes the width and the length of the parietal foramen, and that can be used to calculate the diameter of that eye hole. And to scale the size of this eye hole, this parietal foramen, with the rest of the skull, I'm also measuring the foramen magnum. That's where your skull meets your spine. That's this hole in the back of your skull, as well as the orbit. So that's the eye socket as well. And after taking those measurements, we can mush them together in a variety of different ways, run our statistical tests, and see if there's any change in the size of this feature with latitude. And for nearly all of these data, there was no consistent increase or decrease in size across these 3 different latitudes. In fact, we saw something kind of weird for a couple of variables related to the width of that parietal foramen. The only time we saw significant differences was that our representatives from the Bahamas actually had larger parietal foramen at some point. So these middle guys got big for some reason. Now, the reason this is happening needs way more further probing into. It could be behavioral, it could be completely random, it could be something else entirely. But regardless, we see that this latitudinal hypothesis doesn't really stand up in this instance. Now, again, being a paleontologist, when I saw these data, all I could think about was what this means for interpreting this organ for the fossil record. To me, it shows that any changes that I observe in the fossil record might be more strongly linked to behavior than to geography. But there is something else unique that these equatorial lizards have in common. They're mostly geckos, which are nocturnal. And if you're only going out at night, you don't need a parietal eye to receive signals from the sun. So not only have we sort of lost this equatorial geographic hypothesis, but we've gained one in its place that this might be more strongly linked to behavior and nocturnality. And all of that sets me up with some pretty solid research questions. If we know that there's a skeletal evidence of this parietal eye, can we actually track the evolution of this feature in the fossil record? And spoiler alert, yes, we can. And since we know that this organ has a strong connection with behavior and possibly temperature regulation and metabolism, can we use the fossil record to learn more about the physiology of these animals or even major shifts in physiology? Can it tell us about how extinct organisms interacted with their environment? And if we see these major shifts in physiology, can that tell us about the changing environments of Earth's past? So it turns out this one organ is extremely important for understanding major changes in the fossil record. Now, to look into these questions further, I'm looking not only at the fossil record of early reptiles and their ancestors, but also the fossils of early mammal ancestors as well, spanning from a period of about 100 million years from the late Carboniferous to the end of the Triassic. That's where you saw that yellow circle appear at the top of the screen. That means these fossils are about 320 to about 201 million years old. So this is a very old group of animals that we're looking at. And the animals we're looking at here, they cover a wide variety of body shapes and sizes, diets spanning from carnivorous and herbivorous, and ecosystems spanning from the land and the sea. And what you can see from the collage here is that there's also a great array in the size and shape of that eye hole, that parietal foramen that presumably housed the parietal eye. In some, the foramen appears relatively large compared to the rest of the skull, and some it's a bit smaller. And in some, I hope you guys can see my cursor here, but the middle guy in the bottom row has no parietal foramen at all. And looking at all these fossils, I started to notice a trend. If we line these things up by age, you can see the oldest here on the far left from the late Carboniferous and early Permian. They have that parietal foramen, but to me, it's not the most conspicuous portion of the skull. It's relatively small, and it doesn't seem like there's anything too special about it. However, as we continue a little further into the Permian, the foramen becomes a lot larger in comparison to the rest of the skull, only for it to sort of shrink again towards the end of the Permian into the Triassic, and then completely lost in some lineages within the Triassic. We do see a few relict lineages of these ancient reptiles retain that eye, only for them to go extinct eventually, as well as our early lizard ancestors retain that parietal foramen as well. Anyways, so that sets me up with this hypothesis based on this observation, that the size of the parietal foramen changes significantly over time. And if the data supports this hypothesis, we can start to form new hypotheses as to why this change may be occurred. So to test this, I took the same measurements as I did before with the lizards, only this time we're looking at the fossil record. And again, we mushed them together in a variety of different ways to see if there were any significant differences through time. Now, before I really get into this data, I know it's bad form to present data with a caveat, but I do want to point out this is preliminary data based on a smaller number of reptiles. Scientists often prefer to test smaller sample sizes at first, just to see if there's any initial trends. And if there are, then we can continue to invest more time and energy in collecting more data and running more sophisticated analyses. But I was really pleased to see that even with a small sample size, there were some really interesting trends. Firstly, there is an increase in the size of the parietal foramen as we move into the middle Permian, only for it to drop as we leave the Permian and move into the Triassic. So what does that mean? To understand these data a bit better and why this trend might be occurring, it's important to understand the changing environment during this time. Now, compared to today, the Permian was a much hotter environment than what we experience, and the time is typically characterized by arid and dry climates. The beginning of the Permian is marked by the collapse of the Carboniferous rainforest, leaving large expansive deserts in their place. At this time, all of Earth's continents are united into a single continent called Pangaea, so truly the expansiveness of this arid and desert-like ecosystem is unmatched by anything that occurs on Earth today. Now, when you have a single large landmass like this, the interior of the landmass experiences something called continental climate, which also includes extreme monsoon seasons. All of this causes a really large amount of variation in heat and cold. With this extreme variation happening in the environment, it could be hypothesized that having a larger parietal eye could better assist these animals in regulating their body processes on both a daily and seasonal basis. But at the moment, we don't really have a way to test that hypothesis. Now, the end of the Permian is marked by the worst extinction event known in Earth's history, much worse than the event that killed off the dinosaurs almost 200 million years later. Large igneous provinces, so basically these giant volcanic eruptions, are erupting gigatons of carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases into the Earth, which is increasing Earth's temperatures dramatically over a relatively short period of geologic time. It's estimated something like 70% of land species go extinct, as well as about 80% of marine species. So this is an absolutely massive extinction. Now, it can be hard to pinpoint why the things that survived did so, but there's a few hypotheses as to why that might be the case. The first hypothesis is that burrowing animals made up a large component of the survivors. Lots of animals burrow, and there are a lot of reasons why an animal might burrow, ranging from hibernation to storing food or creating nesting sites. However, the end of the Permian and the early Triassic is marked by a pretty large number of burrows and burrowing species compared to today. The idea as to why this might be the case is that burrows also provide protection from harsh environments. Even a really shallow burrow, just a few feet deep, produce conditions with consistently mild temperatures and humidity. And those conditions are consistent, again, on a daily and seasonal basis. So if we remember how extreme that Permian environment is and how it only becomes more extreme with the onset of this extinction event, burrows are a really excellent shield for these conditions. And just so you don't think I've gotten too far off topic here, I think this third eye might be a signal for showing us paleontologists who might be burrowing and who's not. What I'm showing you here is a worm lizard called an amphibanian. I'm actually showing you a fossil here, but this is a type of lizard that is alive today, and we have them roaming across Central and parts of North America as well. Now, unlike many of its lizard relatives, it does not have that parietal eye, and you can see there's no parietal foramen on that skull. If you're a burrower, you're potentially spending less time outside, and there's less need to have an organ on top of your head that uses sun to regulate body processes. Now, this isn't a hard and fast anatomical rule, but I'd say there is a bit of a trend here. And it turns out that many animals that we presume were burrowing during the Permian and Triassic do have relatively small parietal foramina, or none at all. Now, the second hypothesis is that endotherms survive really well. Endotherms are warm-blooded animals, or animals that are able to regulate their body temperature without the use of the sun. It would completely make sense that if you're able to regulate your body temperature, you wouldn't need another organ that detects the sunlight that tells you that it's time to go outside and adjust your temperature. We see endothermy arise in two lineages around this time. There's the mammal ancestors, which I'm sure most of you, if you think of a warm-blooded animal, you're thinking of mammals, but also archosaurs. These are the ancestors of both crocodilians and birds. And there are many lines of fossil evidence that point to high rates of growth and metabolism in those animals as well. And without the parietal foramen taking up really important real estate on the skull, both of these lineages also did something really interesting as well. Both over the course of tens of millions of years developed holes in their skull. And we're going to go through this graphic slowly together. I really do hope you can see my cursor, but if you can't, we're looking at panel 1. At the very top of the skull, there's a hole here, and that's for the parietal foramen. That's where the eye hole is. If we go down the side, you can see the rest of the skull. And then down here is the lower jaw as well. And you see all of these white and black striations coming up. Those are the muscles that are connecting the lower jaw to the skull. So over millions of years, you see holes develop in the skull as we move to panel 2 and to panel 3. And then up into panel 4, those muscles actually grow on the outer surface of the skull. And the reason that's happening is that it allows this animal to create a stronger and more efficient bite. And without, again, that parietal foramen taking important real estate up on the skull, there's more room for those jaw muscles to attach. And as a result, you see some of the best and strongest bites of evolution so far, and you see some of the top predators of the time evolve with extremely strong skulls and powerful bites. And that tells us a lot about the Triassic landscape as it recovers. This is a landscape filled with much more, efficient animals. That includes things like early archosaurs and their dinosaur descendants that have evolved the ability to regulate their body temperature, as well as other processes like these extremely powerful jaw muscles, making them really fierce predators. And at the same time, we have mammals evolving, and while they're not the top dogs yet, they're sort of creeping onto this landscape too. They're not the top predators, but they're doing something really interesting as well. There's a lot of lines of evidence and hypotheses that mammals are becoming nocturnal at this time as well. They're staying safe by exploring the world and staying away from all these top predators when they're asleep. And if you're exploring the world at night, just like those geckos we saw earlier, You don't need a parietal foramen to get signals from the sun. Okay, so we have learned a lot. We know that the parietal eye is an organ that helps ectotherms regulate their body temperatures. It's not strongly linked to geography, as some folks might have thought in the past. In fact, it's probably more closely linked to behavior, including things like circadian rhythm, so that day and night cycling. And Earth's past, in Earth's past, animals with the parietal eye, it's changed shape and size throughout Earth's history, and those changes are linked to both major environmental conditions as well as behavioral changes in these animals as well. So that is what I have for you today. Thank you all for coming and attending and sacrificing what is a nice day in New Haven this afternoon. Quick shout out to my co-authors and support staff, funding sources, and my lab mates, and I am happy to take any questions.
Hi, Kelsey. Thanks so much for that great talk. I think this is a really exciting topic. I don't think we've ever had anyone talk about a third eye before. So thank you for your presentation.
Totally.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions already from audience members. So thank you guys so much for putting those in the Q&A. And I'd encourage anyone else who has a question to please submit them. But I'll just jump right in because we have a lot to go through. So we have one audience member, Niels, ask, is there the equivalent of an optic nerve behind the third eye?
Oh, that's an excellent question. There's a nerve system attaching this to the pineal gland. They're very closely related. As far as what they might share in common with the optic nerve when we think of like our two forward-facing eyes, I'll be honest, I haven't looked way too much into that, but it's a great thing to Google. I will look that up later, and if you want to send me an email, we can talk about it.
Cool. Okay, there is a question from Hayden that says, is it possible that the increased size of the parietal eye in geckos found in the Bahamas as opposed to Cuba or southern Florida could be due to island size? So they say, I'm thinking island syndrome, and would be interesting to see if there's a trend in which island size impacts not just the overall size of the individual, but also specific body structures.
That's an excellent question. So the data that we had, we did scale it for size. So at least we know that's not potentially confounding our data in that way. Why these lizards have a much larger, I should say, it's only one variable where we saw that sort of random increase. So it could just be a completely random thing. All of our other variables just said the same boring thing, that there's no change in any of this trend. It's just like this one weird thing. And it could be random. It could just be like out of 57 specimens total, this is a small slice of those specimens, the one from the Bahamas. So maybe if we had a larger sample, we would see it even out a little bit. Or it could be a behavioral thing. Like, I'd be really interested to know if there are any herpetologists that have done field observations of the same species across isolated populations and see how their behaviors might be different. So it definitely needs more probing into, but there's a lot of cool hypotheses that we can already put forward on that.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. I was going to ask, are you planning on following up on some of those questions in your work that you're finishing up for your PhD?
I probably won't have time for it during the course of my PhD, but I'd love to look at just other populations of lizards that are isolated, but are within the same species or genus, and seeing if we get the same trend, because that would only, support the hypothesis that we put forward.
Great. Thanks. I'm going to go to a question from Shyam, who says, in early life, human babies can have a hole in the middle of their skull at the top of their head, and one can see skin on the part of that skull move with their heartbeat. Any connection to the parietal eye? I was thinking of that slide you had with all the different organisms that had the different openings in the skull, over time.
So human babies have something called a fontanelle, and it's really just a result of the bones haven't had time to really grow together yet. So over the course of someone growing up, they will eventually close that hole in the top of their skull. It's not related to the parietal eye as far as we know. It's just a result of the bones not having grown the full way. But we actually do see that in the baby lizards. We had a few baby lizards in our sample, and we had to get rid of them because that eye hole hadn't really formed yet, because just the skull hadn't really formed yet. So it kind of actually got in the way of some of our data collection.
No, that's interesting though. I guess there's a similar sort of process of the skull forming that happens in multiple different organisms. So super fascinating. Okay, there's a question from Joseph that says, what about the evolution of ichthyosaurs? Similar time? I guess the question would be like, do they have a parietal eye? Or I guess maybe a better question would be like, do you know of other similar?
I should say that the data I showed you today of the fossils was that preliminary data set. I'm looking across basically all of reptiles going from the late Carboniferous to the Triassic. I just measured some ichthyosaurs this morning.
Cool.
So they do have that parietal foramen. I'm really curious to see, for those who don't know, ichthyosaurs are an aquatic reptile that evolved at the early Triassic, maybe the late Permian, but we haven't found those fossils yet. At least I don't think. Anyways, they do have that parietal foramen, but does it help them signal like going to the surface of the water, for example? We don't know, or at least I haven't found literature that covers that yet. So I've measured some, they have it. If it does anything special because they're in the water, I'm not sure.
Okay, great. There's another question from Edlin that says, was the parietal eye present as well in basal synapsids like Dimetrodon and those of the early Permian? So another questions about other organisms that might have been,
So those lineages, the Dimetrodon's an early mammal ancestor, and that whole mammal lineage does have that parietal foramen. Up until around that Permo-Triassic extinction, you do see it start to shrink in size, just like the reptiles, and you start to see those muscles growing on top of the skull. So it makes you wonder if there is a trade-off between having big, strong muscles and potentially having this organ on top of your head, or is at that point the organ, like, is that foramen, that eye hole, just a vestigial structure because these things are becoming endothermic? There's a lot of ideas as to like why you see that disappearance, but we can solidly see that there is a disappearance and there are no mammals today currently with that parietal foramen.
Interesting. And then I was wondering, like, what are the muscles, because you were saying there might have been this trade-off between like this parietal opening and muscles. So what are the kinds of muscles, or what are they used for?
It's mostly your jaw muscles. And so you do see an increase, basically an idea that you're getting a stronger and more efficient bite, especially in these early reptile relatives, the archosaurs. They become like some of the top predators, and there's been a lot of finite element analysis, basically testing the structure of these skulls and seeing, you know, how strong they are and at what point can they break. These things become really, really strong, and they have the muscles to accompany it.
Okay, really interesting. Thanks. One guest, Michael, asks, in the past, there's been a hypothesis with some supportive data that the parietal eye can detect polarized light and could be used for orientation.
I think I've read that hypothesis, and I'll be honest, there's just like a ton more work that needs to be done on what this organ does in living animals. There's a lot more evidence that it points towards, you know, circadian rhythms and things like that. But I'll be honest, the literature lacked a lot past the 80s. So some new research looking into that area, I think would be a really interesting area to explore, to see if there's any interactions with like polarized light or orientation. You see some hypotheses appear that it helps things, what's the word I'm looking for? Migrate. That maybe it's helping, that's some sort of sensation that helps us aid in migration or tells you when to migrate or where you're migrating to. Just a ton more work needs to be done to figure that out.
Great. Awesome. Good for you. Lots of research questions to explore. Yeah, in the future. Okay, we have one question from Natasha, who asks, is like a broader question, what has been your favorite part of the research process so far?
Oh God, this is going to sound dorky. I just really like measuring things. And I like listening to my podcast and my music while I do it. And I'll say that that varies for different projects. For this project, the data collection has been really exciting. The conceptualization behind why we see the trends that we're seeing has also been really exciting. And for some projects, you just like to sit back and sort of do the data input. So this one has definitely been data collection and conceptualization.
Okay, great. And we had a question from William that says, what correspondence do you see now between the perception of the human third eye and the parietal eye? It has been said that the third eye sees truth of consciousness as opposed to perceiving the world. So I guess this is like in reference to sort of the thing that you talked about at the beginning of your presentation.
There's a lot of different religions as well as mystical practices that believe in the concept of a third eye. And typically that third eye is considered a positive thing, that it can see into wisdom and greater knowledge and things like that. Tapping into it, I don't know, especially it's hard to say. I don't really practice any of those religions. But I do know that there's some rooted truth in those religions, and that some people have based it on the pineal gland. That's what we know. I can't say true or false about different religious aspects of it, but some religions have looked into the body, and that's where that belief might come from.
Okay, cool. Thanks. We also had a question from Tracy here that asks about crocodiles. It's sort of, there are many questions in here, but they were saying most animals like being touched or petted on their head, and it happens to be like in the area where the third eye would be. And so do you think that that has like anything to do with a third eye, or like do lizards like being pet on the top of their head where their third eye is?
Probably not. I like having my hair played with and such like that. And I think it's just a tactile sensation on your skin. And I'd say that like my cat would probably agree with that. And I've seen videos of lizards that are pets that I've enjoyed that too. So no, I don't think it's related to the parietal eye per se, but just an enjoyable sensation.
Great. Awesome. We did have a question from Kate that asked if this presentation is going to be recorded. And I just wanted to say for all of our audience members, yes, all of our presentations for this Research Spotlight series are always recorded, and we upload them to the Yale Peabody YouTube channel, normally a couple of days after they take place. And so if you ever want to look back at any of the talks that we've done, or if you missed one and you want to catch up on it, you can always search for those on YouTube. And then I sort of had just a question for you about like what you talked about. There are all of these things that you'd like to look into more, and you think that this research topic needs a lot more focus. And so if you had to pick sort of a hypothesis or something to focus on, like what would you be most interested in researching about the parietal eye in the future?
I would still just love to look more into other groups. I'd like to kind of repeat the anole experiment with other species, because, maybe they're just a weird one, or maybe that's an actual, trend that we're seeing, like lizards don't follow this geographic rule. I would love to dig more into that. I'll be honest, I'm not really like an experimentalist. It's really stressful to keep live animals in your lab, I'll be honest, and to run those kinds of experiments, they're like a super necessary step. And so I could say I would love to see people do experiments on like night cycling and stuff in these lizards. I will probably never tackle it just because of the logistics is like really overwhelming. And I'm a paleontologist, so I love understanding these things in the fossil record. So I think like my long-winded answer to that is, yeah, we should look at the extant stuff more. If I'm looking at the fossil record, I think I'd really like to tackle and see if there's a difference between marine stuff and terrestrial stuff, like these ichthyosaurs. Like, are they special because they're in the water, or does their parietal foramen do the same thing that everybody else's does?
Okay, cool. And so then all of the fossils that you had in the figures that you presented, like from Cuba and the Bahamas and stuff like that, those are fossils that were collected by someone else. Like you didn't go do that field work or measure live animals in the field.
You need a really large sample size for something like this. So all of our lizards were extant living lizards that were coming from these different island nations. The fossils came from publications all over the world, as well as fossils that we have housed here in the Peabody Museum, which are collected all over the United States, as well as some neighboring institutions as well that have collaborated on this stuff. So, you know, I get to travel to a lot of museums, I get to read a lot of literature and look at these things. So that's how most of the data collection is going by.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And then we have another question from an audience member here. Whoops, I just lost my question. Okay, it's back from William. Would you summarize the kinds of perception of this eye in addition to temperature? So the parietal eye, I guess, what kinds of things does it sense in addition to temperature?
I don't think we really think of it as being like an image forming eye.
Okay.
It is sensing, as far as I understand, light and light cycling. And that's, I mean, it's an eye. It's not gonna, you're not gonna hear with that eye because it's an eye. As
Right.
far, I think like it's perceiving light, but as far as what's it doing, that's the question of the hour.
Okay, yeah. But like, do you think it can sense like temperature and things like that too? Or is that also, you think, based on maybe light? Like
It can
light is sort of
probably-
a proxy for temperature or something like
Light
that.
is probably a proxy for temperature. I'm not going to say it can't sense temperature, but it's probably sensing something that the rest of the body is also sensing as well. It's hard to say if, like, you know, this lizard's detecting temperature or it's feeling hot. Is the parietal eye the on-off switch that tells it it's time to like go back in? That we don't know yet.
Mhm. Cool. And then I was wondering, you talked about, I think it was ichthyosaurs before, that might have like some sort of similar structure. And so, like, it sounds like there's terrestrial and aquatic mammals that have this structure and it would be useful for them. And so, like, do you think it would work in the same way in like an underwater environment as it would in a terrestrial environment?
So reptiles with the structure that are living underwater, is it functioning the same way? I'm sure it's detecting light, which may in turn be helpful. This is just, I'm speculating here. It's probably helpful for detecting how close or far away you are from the surface of the water. And if you think about like aquatic mammals and these extinct aquatic reptiles, you know, they do need to surface occasionally to breathe. So is it helping with that potentially instead of like properly thermoregulating? Maybe, but again, that's just a hypothesis and it would require way more work to actually test.
Okay, interesting. And do you know if there are people who are sort of testing for those differences in live mammals, like marine animals or something like that right
so
now?
there are no mammals alive today that have that parietal eye. So they just have that pineal gland tucked within their brain. So what whales are doing is beyond me.
Okay.
They're getting
Really
their signals somewhere else.
Thanks. Cool. Okay. Yeah. And then I guess a question just for you, like, do you know what's next for you yet? What's sort of like your timeline, like research wise here at Yale?
Yeah, so I guess this was in my introduction earlier, but I'm a PhD student here. I'm hoping to graduate next spring, fingers crossed. There's a few more projects I really want to finish up within the next 6 to 12 months in order to do that. But hopefully you see some exciting things from me within that time.
Okay, great. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kelsey. I think we're about close to our ending time here for today. And we don't have any more audience questions, I don't think. Oops. Great. So just a few closing announcements here for everyone in the audience. Thanks so much for joining us today. And you can look forward to our next Research Spotlight series, which will actually feature me because it is my last talk. I'm going to graduate this spring. And so, yes, I will be presenting my PhD research, which is on selective logging, sustainability in Central Africa in Congo Basin forests. And you can catch that talk on April 27th. I just want to plug that you can find all of our You can find all of our events on the Peabody mailing list and on the Peabody website. We also have social media accounts like on Twitter and Instagram. And so please follow those so that you can catch all of our upcoming online and in-person programs for this semester and beyond. I do see there was one question here about if Kelsey had a social media or Twitter account. So Kelsey,
Yes,
did you?
It's hard to spell all at once, so I'm just going to share this slide one more time. On Twitter, it's reptiliferous, at reptiliferous, like fossiliferous, but reptiles. Or feel free to send me an email as well.
Great. Awesome. Well, good luck. I hope to see all of your articles expeditiously published in the
Fingers
next
crossed.
few months. Yes. Okay. And thank you so much to our audience members for joining us today. It was a real treat. And I hope everyone enjoys your Thursday.